Hello students, it's me, Mr. O'Brien. Yes, I'm back. I'm glad to be back, glad to be here. This is the introduction and the very first WIDIP for Modern World History class. I want you to know that I love Modern World History class. I love the material, I love the content, I love the history itself. But one of the things I love about it is the fact that you all are here as seniors. You decided to take this class, you voluntarily signed up to take this class, and I want you to know that means a lot to me, and I'm very flattered, and I'm very gracious and grateful that you did that. So I want this to be a great experience no matter how it goes down. I'm going to try to do that. We're going to try to keep it interesting. We're going to do WIDIPs just like this. We're going to do a WIDIP today. You should have some paperwork that was sent home or you picked up from the school and you have it home. We'll get started on those types of things, but this is going to be sort of the format. And once again, thank you. You ever have a question, I'm here for you. Okay? All right, here we go. Let's get started with Modern World History class. All right, here we go. Let's just do, you don't need to write this down, but let's just do a brief review, shall we? Do you remember what we studied when you were a junior? What was the sort of the order of the course? What did we start the course off at? Do you recall? Well, if you hopefully you remember, we talked about, it was like Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and people like that, and so we called that pre-written history. Recall that? Okay. You had the pictures of the skulls, etc., etc. Then, if you recall, we did what I called the River Valley civilizations. Remember, you did a little group project on river valleys. Remember the Egyptians, the Indus Valley, the Chinese, and the Mesopotamians. Remember the Eastern Hemisphere map. Then we went into the Greeks and the Romans, of course. That's always fun, those types of things. Then you recall the, and who's hanging out in the background of this whole thing? The Chinese are always there. The Chinese are always around. And then, of course, the Roman Empire fell, the Western Roman Empire fell, and that led us to what we called the Dark Ages, if you recall that. Dark Ages. And, of course, when we talked about the Dark Ages, don't forget we talked about Islam, and we talked about the Mongols. Remember the Mongols? Mongols are a favorite of the students here for sure. Everybody likes the Mongols. And then when that sort of came to the end, and as the course itself was ending, we started to talk about the time periods that all sort of happened together. For example, the Renaissance. I think I spelled that wrong, but we'll just put it just like that. This Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, remember all that business? Martin Luther, and we did the scientific revolution, remember Galileo and Newton, and then if you recall, we sort of ended up with the age of exploration. If you recall all that business, we talked about, of course, the contact, Columbus, the conquistadors, all those types of things. And if you recall, we did something sort of interesting. There was a sort of a timeline where we did the amount of culture, and we sort of learned about all what historians sort of agree are all these time periods. Okay, so we call this, of course, is just that same thing, pre-written history. Then if you recall this part in here, we call this ancient history. Recall that? Like we said, the ancient Egyptians, or we said the ancient Greeks, or the ancient Romans. And then if you recall, we called this part right in here, the whole point of that graph was that this was in the middle. And so this time period is also called the Middle Ages. All right? And then really what was going on was this time period, as the junior world history course ended, this was the beginning of modern, what historians call modern history. So maybe you remember the question, what were the Middle Ages in the middle of? Well, the Middle Ages were in the middle of ancient history and modern history. Okay, so here we are. Really, world history class as a junior sort of got into, if you really want to get technical, it got into modern history. All right, so this, of course, this class is called Modern World History, so this will be a continuation. Okay, so what are we going to get going with here? We're going to start, and we're literally going to start today with a time period called the Enlightenment. Now, when I think about this word, I sort of think about a cartoon strip, a cartoon animated video. What happens when a cartoon character gets an idea? Oh, well, a little light bulb is drawn above their head that is turned on. In other words, the person who was in the dark is enlightened. The person who didn't have knowledge suddenly does have knowledge. So what the Enlightenment people of the Enlightenment believed about themselves is that they were bringing light, they were bringing knowledge to a world that was really still technically in the dark. And one of the main aspects of this that we will discover is something called the French Revolution, where this really manifests itself. All right, now the French Revolution and the American Revolution actually happens first. It's very influential actually on the French Revolution, but these are going to be the very first things that we start with as we start talking about modern history. So let's just do that right now, shall we? Let's get started with our very first wit up of the year. The very first wit up of the year has to do with this time period called the Enlightenment, and what our topic today is going to be something called the Philosophes of the Enlightenment. The Philosophes. Now that's kind of an interesting looking word, Mr. Ryan. What the heck's up with that? Philosophes. That looks like it's spelled incorrectly, like it's not a real word. Well, you can see here that it really is philosophers. And what I would sort of say to you is this is French for philosophers, the philosophers of something called the Enlightenment. All right? Now here's the best way to remember this. This was a time period. How's that sound? And these were men of that time period. We're going to focus on 4 of them. There was a whole bunch. We're really sort of talking about the late 1600s and into the 1700s AD, right up until the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789. These are guys who influenced those 2 major events. All right, so here we go. What did they believe? Okay, well, if you recall a lot of stuff about the Dark Ages, one of the big aspects of the Dark Ages was that people were not very well educated. So they were believers in myths and superstitions, and they were always very worried about things, and things were taken for granted. Nobody asked if something is better. So people believed, they believed what they were told. They followed traditions to the letter. The Philosophes of the Enlightenment said, yeah, okay, the world has been like that, but we want to change that. We want to, as I sort of described, they wanted to enlighten people who were in the dark, who were not knowledgeable. They wanted to bring knowledge to a vast population of people that they felt were unknowledgeable or really unintelligent. Okay? The second thing I would say about the Philosophes of the Enlightenment is that they were generally religious. They were not atheists or anything like that. They believed that God does exist, okay, but he is not a personal God. And he is not a God that is intervening in your daily life. He's not omnipotent and having something to do with everything that you do. Remember, up until the Middle Ages, and not just Christianity, all ancient religions believed that the gods were super busy and involved. And why did you trip on that rock? Well, the gods made it so. All right? It's the scientific revolution and the studies of Copernicus and Galileo where they start to show that the universe acts like a machine, and so therefore the Christian God is not necessarily as busy. He's an observer. All right? So this is something else that these Philosophes certainly believed. They were certainly believers and followers, great followers of science. The Philosophes of the Enlightenment loved Galileo. They loved Newton. They loved those guys. Okay? Sometimes this time period is called the Age of Reason. All right? Now, how many times? The best way for me to describe this to you is when you're having a heated argument with one of your parental units, and you say to them, you're not being reasonable. What are you implying when you say to someone you're not being reasonable? You're implying that they're not thinking it all the way through. And so this is sort of a scientific method, I think I would argue. And this scientific method, of course, comes out of the scientific revolution, the Galileos and the Newtons, etc. But how do you learn the truth? Well, you've got to observe. You've got to listen. You've got to touch it. All right, and you can see I'm getting at the 5 senses right here, aren't I? So you've got to be logical in your thinking. You've got to be reasonable in your thinking. And you've got to use the 5 senses to find the truth. All right, and reason, the Philosophes believe, therefore, should be a person's guide to life. You shouldn't just accept things. You should think things through. A reasonable person will never accept something right away that they're told. A reasonable person will think through all sides of an issue, all sides of an aspect, all sides of a hypothesis, and that would be a great guide to life if everybody could do that, the Philosophes believe. Okay? Number 5. Here you go. Here's my point that science is very important to these guys. Science, if you recall, Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton. Go back and review your discussion on the scientific revolution and how they demonstrated that, hey, the universe just works. The universe is going to operate the way it's going to operate, and it's predictable. So therefore, if things are predictable, is God really busy doing these things? No, he's actually taking a step back. You could argue he's able to take a step back. But the point is that the universe works the way it works. And those are called natural laws. And this is going to become a very important aspect of the Philosophes, and maybe you recognize this term, natural law. And this is a discussed topic today that we'll see here in just a moment. A man should use reason to discover these laws. All right? Something that the Philosophes also believed was this concept of what is government's duty? Government's duty is to protect those they govern. They looked at history and said that governments, and they were right, they looked at history and said governments have really not been good to the ordinary folks, to the people that they govern. They don't protect them, they take advantage of them. They are brutal to them in many cases. And so the Philosophes said, if the government cannot, at the very minimum, protect those they govern, and if a government fails to do this or is out of line, it just ignores it and oversteps its rights, then what do people have the right to do? They have the right to abolish and replace that government. Now, if you look carefully at this whole thing, you may recognize this whole concept. This should not be foreign to you. This should not be something that you've never heard before. This, again, in these times, is something that's being brought up again. This is something that is being discussed today as we speak. This type of thing is being discussed, and this belief is being discussed. Okay, so what's the importance of the Philosophes? Well, I would say that the importance of the Philosophes revolves around the fact that more than anything else, these guys were super influential, and they were able to influence revolutionary movements around the world. And the most famous ones, and so what I'm talking about is groups of people who rose up against their governments and revolted. There was a revolution to change, and the most notable occurrences where these Philosophes had influence with their writings were in the British colonies of North America, and of course that's the American Revolution, and France. And we're going to see the vast majority of these Philosophes, of course that's a French word as I mentioned, the majority of these Philosophes were from France. Okay, so that's really the most important thing of all. These Philosophes, because they were writers, you would have to assume that they were all educated. And let's be honest with each other, in these days, and most of history, who got educated? Wealthy people did. So all of these guys come from wealthy background. They're privileged, nobility, all right? And what they really did is sort of an interesting, that you can make the argument that these are people of great influence, but they're people of great character as well. What are they basically attacking? It's interesting, they are attacking a system from which they benefited. The revolutions they spawned, as I call it, hurt their own high standing of where they were from, especially in France. So really the French Philosophes, one could argue, were the ones who were really taking it to the extreme and really talking about things that they truly believed in so much that they made their own situation difficult. Okay, so let's do a little sort of graph here to sort of explain this and sort of finish this off. And this is sort of what I would say about all this stuff. And that is, okay, how did history work? How did history work before the Philosophes? And I'll just call them Phils, okay? How did it work before the Philosophes? And these are going to be, you can watch this for a second if you would like before you write anything down. Well, before the Philosophes, you could make the argument that how did things work? Well, there was God, or in even more ancient times in the polytheistic societies, there were gods, okay? And then who was right below the god or the gods? Well, the king, the pharaoh, the emperor, the queen. And how did that person become the king, the pharaoh, the emperor, the queen, whatever, the dictator? That person was chosen by God, chosen by the gods, okay? And then who came next? Well, our discussion of oligarchies, and trust me, we're going to get back into that. You have all the people of the royal family. You have the nobles, that's the wealthy people, the landowners. And eventually, even when they started to have some representative government, people in the parliament. Okay? And then who does that leave all the way at the bottom? What does history tell us? Well, the regular folks, the peasants. Dare I also put that right there? The peasants. Do you recall the term the serfs? What did we have in ancient Rome? We had the plebeians. Oh yes, the plebeians, the common people. Well, what are the Philosophes coming in and saying here? So you get here to after the Philosophes, okay? After the Philosophes. Well, the Philosophes are basically saying, yeah, God's there. He's there, okay? But the next thing below God is not the king, it's you. All right? And you are important. It should be listened to. And then below you are things like the government, things like the king, things like the parliament. Okay? And so that was their argument that they made. That was the argument that they were trying to make when they did this. Okay, so now what I would like you to do is, you've also been given this particular handout. This particular handout is called the Enlightenment, obviously. Okay? And you can see that there's a bunch of stuff in here. One of the things I want you to add here is this time period was called the Age of Reason. Age of Reason, right? Remember I said reason was a guide to life. That's what they believed. Okay? Alrighty. And what I want you to do with this is just sort of go through it. You're not going to hand this in, but this is just a yes or no, and you go through this thing. It's really the four main guys. Okay, so let's go through let's just briefly go through this. And this first one is, his name is John Locke, and I'm going to make it a little notation. He's the British philosopher. Okay? He's the one from Great Britain. And I want to say something about John Locke. If you study American history, you're going to discover that John Locke is one of the two people in American history that most Americans have never heard of. He is super influential. All right, so now what you do with this whole thing is you basically read the statements of each person and you say yes or no, is this true in the United States today? Just put a Y or an N. Okay, so, and this is obviously opinion based. Okay, but I wanted to do something here real fast. Look what John Locke said. These are his basic statements. All men are free and equal at birth. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the ownership of property. Citizens have the right to overthrow the government when their natural rights are violated. Rulers receive the right to govern from the people, and unfair rulers can be forced from power. Now, you may be saying to yourself, that's weirdly familiar. Okay, well, this, ladies and gentlemen, is a copy of the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. I just want to check this out. This is the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Check. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Go back up there. Life, liberty, pursuit of property, happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive in these ends, it is right of the people to alter, abolish it, and to institute a new government. Rulers have the right to govern from the people. Unfair rulers can be forced from power. Discussion of natural rights. So you can see, of course, we all know that Thomas Jefferson was the writer of the Declaration of Independence. Look who was super influential on Thomas Jefferson. This guy, John Locke. Okay? All right, let's make a note of this guy, Baron de Montesquieu. He was the, I'm going to call him the nobleman philosophe. He was came from a very well-off background. He is certainly an example of one of these guys who is advocating for the destruction of a system that he benefited from. Okay? The next one is Voltaire. Voltaire, we're going to call him the fiction writer philosophe. Okay? And then the last one here, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You can see the Frenchness of that name. He was we're going to say the most radical philosophe. All right, and I think you'll see that as you go through all these statements. And then, look, I would sort of go through these things, and as you go through it, yeah, you should answer these questions and try to fill this thing out. And then I think this approved, disapproved thing on the second piece of paper is very good, and you can go through that as well. Okay? All right, folks, there we go. That's the way to get started today. There's nothing super specific as far as homework or anything like that. We'll get into that. We got plenty of time for that. But again, here we are. I want to say thank you once again. Welcome to Modern World History. Stick with me, hang with me, and we will have a good time. All right, everybody. Aloha.